Infallibility of the head of church. Every religious doctrine should be examined before it is accepted. God demands this from you in order to reduce the adversary's influence, because then you will also understand how he works yourselves. His objective is to infiltrate the divine truth with inaccuracies, but the human being can certainly become aware of it if he seriously examines what he is offered with the desire only to accept the divine, the truth. The opponent uses human will, that is, he influences people to arbitrarily add other teachings to the divine teaching and to pass them on as God-given teachings. But human work is not without error, and consequently the pure divine teaching is spoiled too, and even more so the less people scrutinize and think for themselves. And once again it is the opponent's doing that human doctrines inherently prevent their scrutiny and contemplation. That people are therefore required to accept each religious doctrine unconditionally, and scrutiny of it is made out to be wrong. This furthers the activity of the Prince of Lies very much indeed. But God requires people to have a living faith, that is, a faith of heart, a faith which affirms with full conviction what it is taught. Anyone who seriously thinks about it will be able to affirm every divine truth wholeheartedly. However, he will never be able to accept the action of Satan. He will soon recognize it as human work and, having found it to be worthless, thus abandon it with an easy heart, examine everything and hold on to the best. And because scrutiny inevitably has to entail the recognition and rejection of every error, the adversary knew how to prevent the examination of religious dogma by establishing a teaching which was intended to eliminate human thought, and which thus has resulted in very nasty consequences. This concerns the teaching of infallibility of the head of church, which apparently relieves the human being of every responsibility, yet leads him into deep spiritual darkness if it is accepted and regarded as divine truth. Because any misguided teaching could then be added as divine truth without permitting criticism or rejection. And thus the door was opened to every error. A field had been made available to the adversary's activity on which he could scatter his seed widely. People's obligation to believe the teaching of infallibility of the head of church means that every additional teaching or rule set up by the head of church has to be approved or accepted without criticism, and thus the human being's thought and choice are eliminated, even though they are indispensable if the human being is to give account of his relationship to God one day. Every person has to answer for himself. Consequently, he has to make his own decision with complete freedom of will. However, in order to make a decision he has to be able to examine and consider what he should decide on. It should not be the case that an individual person decides and this person then demands of thousands and thousands of people to follow his decision, subsequently expressing this demand in the form of a commandment, a doctrine. Which is undeniably the case if every church commandment were to be acknowledged as in accordance with God's will, because its foundation is there, alleged, infallibility of the head of church. These teachings are now unreservedly accepted without the human being clarifying their meaning and purpose, resulting in routine actions which are unrelated to free decision, profound faith and deeply felt closeness to God. A church service evolved which, in reality, is not a service to God. Customs were introduced which are more or less formalities. The adversary's actions succeeded in alienating people from the truth under the guise of piety, to stop them from using their own thoughts and thus their free decision too, since all this is suppressed by God's adversary due to the dogma of infallibility. Because once this teaching has been made plausible to a person, he will no longer need to have an opinion about it. Thus he accepts without scrutiny. He need not make a decision because someone else has already made a decision on his behalf and free will is not utilized. Instead, The person has to believe what is given to him as religious dogma if he does not want to come into conflict with the particular religious dogma, which the church makes out to be so very important, that the head of church can never err or take wrong measures when he makes a decision concerning the church. God only values free decision-making, but this has to be made by the person himself, and thus the pros and cons of religious dogma have to be considered by him. Only what he can affirm in his heart can be called faith, and not what he finds himself compelled to affirm. Because religious dogma intended by God will bear up to every scrutiny and will be even more convincingly accepted the more the human being delves into it. However, anything that is not of God does not stand up to scrutiny and will be rejected by every person who seriously struggles for knowledge. Amen.